Good evening, everyone. Welcome. I'm here to introduce our final presentation of what has been a very full afternoon of exchanges of ideas. I am Lindsay Harris, the interim Andrew High School Arts Director at the American Academy in Rome. And tonight it is my great pleasure to introduce the first keynote speaker of the Academy's Spring Conference on Political Violence and the Crisis of Democracy, Nancy MacLean. The William H. Chafe Professor of History and Public Policy at Duke University, Professor MacLean is also an award-winning author of several books that investigate the hidden roots of the thought patterns and activist groups that threaten democracy in the United States. This is scholarship that has laid the foundation for many of the ideas discussed today. And as we've heard her name already mentioned in certainly our penultimate presentation, we are delighted to be able to hear from her directly shortly. The resurgence of the Ku Klux Klan, the rise of the radical right, the political perils of the ultra-rich, these and other subjects of MacLean's trenchant scholarship delve deep into the fissures that have divided American society since its inception, and perhaps in a future book before its inception. And as we will hear tonight, these are, of course, ruptures that continue to challenge democracy today. Praise for Professor MacLean's publications highlights her acumen at bringing to light the buried truths behind some of the most unsavory and, of course, as this conference is making plain, violent chapters in American history. Quote, "It is the missing chapter, a key to understanding the politics of the past half century," wrote The Guardian of her most recent book, Democracy in Chains, The Deep History of the Radical Right's Stealth Plan for America, which was a finalist for the National Book Award and the winner of the Los Angeles Times Book Award in Current Affairs, the Lenin Foundation Cultural Freedom Award, and the Lillian Smith Book Award. In the context of this conference, MacLean's scholarship illuminates the current and potential future explosions of ire and unrest that mark but the latest instances of violence being used to political ends, a phenomenon that, as we are learning in this conference, has deep roots that resonate from Italy and beyond. Please join me then in welcoming to the podium Professor MacLean, whose keynote address this evening is titled The Prehistory and Likely Sequels of the January 6, 2021 Insurrection at the US Capitol. Thank you.
Buonasera a tutti. It is such a pleasure to be with you all here tonight. Thank you so much for that generous introduction. And I also want to thank Professor Marla Stone for inviting us all here. I think we're feeling the thrill of coming together in a community, a live community again, of people dealing with important problems that we all care so much about. And I think in some ways you'll find that my talk this evening is a kind of sequel to some of the presentations earlier today. So we're already seeing important continuing themes. So let me just begin by stating the obvious, that the attack on the US Capitol on January 6th stands as the most dramatic case of political violence aimed at the national government in the United States since the Civil War. I'd like to start my lecture, in fact, with a brief video that captures it. And I'm sure that all of you have seen some of the news footage of the siege to prevent the certification of President Biden's victory. But now that we have recordings from multiple vantage points, it is worth viewing to grasp just how dreadful this attack was. The video is just over a minute to give you a sense of the events of that day, so it's really only a sample of the 4 hours of what one House member called savage medieval-style violence after the crowd breached the building. The ferocity followed Donald Trump's rally outside, where he told the many thousands who attended the rally, quote, "If you don't fight like hell, you're not going to have a country anymore." And let's just make sure.
Full Capitol entry. The Capitol building, look at this.
And you don't have to. Oh, closing? Okay. We're all learning things as we go. It will give you a moment to prepare for this because it is has quite an impact. And then back to the beginning. Yeah.
Do you want your house back? Thank you. Full Capitol entry. Storm the Capitol building. Look at this. We cannot hold this without more munitions or more manpower. I need to know from Capitol where do I want to pull back to. There's a fact that we lost the line. We've lost the line.
Too many languages. Okay, so the footage that you just watched conveys the brutality of the attack on the Capitol and the resolve of the frontline militants. Right-wing activists who typically trumpet law and order and exalt the police showed no compunction about assaulting police officers with anything at hand: fists, boots, metal barriers, sticks, lead pipes, baseball bats, crutches, and flagpoles, as well as bear mace and other chemical agents. Anything that could serve as weaponry to get the police out of the way so that the insurrectionists could get inside the building and stop Joe Biden from being proclaimed president. Once the mob rushed the doors and broke the windows and climbed in, as you saw, they roamed the halls chanting the names of Vice President Mike Pence and Speaker of the House Nancy Pelosi while calling out death threats. They bore signs and symbols of America's long vigilante tradition, ever entwined with white supremacy. On the lawn, some erected a gallows to hang Mike Pence for defying Trump's demand that he refused to certify the Electoral College ballots. One insurgent, as Usman mentioned earlier, carried a Confederate battle flag through the rotunda, an act of defilement that wasn't even attempted during the Civil War. Trump flags abounded, along with camouflage attire sporting right-wing imagery and slogans, old and new. By the time the Capitol was finally cleared, near dusk, 5 people had already lost their lives from the mayhem, and almost 150 police officers had suffered wounds or injuries. 1 would die later that night, and 2 took their own lives soon after. After the siege, the Capitol Police, deeply demoralized, lost more than 130 officers to resignations and mass retirements. Astonishingly, those restoring order allowed the overwhelmingly white group of protesters to leave the building without arresting anyone. Only in the weeks and months after the assault were the attackers pursued, using video surveillance, cell phone recordings, and the boastful social media posts of many participants, often with tips from citizen sleuths who saw the posts or recognized faces in the crowd, including in one case, their father. To date, over 700 people have been charged, including leaders of the white power group, the Proud Boys, whom Trump had said earlier should stand down and stand by. Many more have thus far escaped accountability. Above all, those most responsible for the convening and goading of the mob. It's true that Donald Trump underwent a second impeachment, this one for incitement of insurrection, with a masterful case mounted by House Democrats who voted unanimously to convict, joined by some Republican colleagues in both chambers. That made this the most bipartisan impeachment of the 4 in US history. But as Donna Murch mentioned earlier, the overwhelming majority of Republican elected officials took Donald Trump's side. In fact, 197 Republican House members and 43 Republican US senators voted against impeachment of the agitator who had just put their own and others' lives in danger. Thanks to them, he was not convicted because impeachment requires a 2/3 majority in the Senate. This leaves Trump as the only president in US history to be twice impeached, and at least at this moment, still eligible to run for office again in 2020. Evidence gleaned from journalism, the impeachment, and ongoing investigations by the House Select Committee has made it inescapably clear that for Donald Trump and his closest allies, the storming of the Capitol was instrumental after 2 previous stratagems for overthrowing the will of the voters had failed. This then was political violence in its purest sense, blunt force designed to achieve what could not be achieved through the normal political process. It was unleashed to back a coup attempt that capitalized on ambiguities in the Constitution's language for certifying elections to enable the loser to stay in office. So, I think it's also important to be clear and you saw some of this in the video, these were criminal acts, both the violence and the purpose they served. So with that summary for orientation, as I know, we're coming from different countries and different experiences, I want to turn to my core argument, which is that this was not a one-off episode. And it cannot be explained with attention to Donald Trump alone, or social media, or any of the other popular views now circulating. Indeed, to settle for this simplicity is to leave democracy profoundly vulnerable to smarter and better executed coup attempts in the future, as Andrea suggested earlier, not only in the US, but also given American power and standing throughout the world. Instead, we need to understand that presidency and its climax in the attack on the country as the ghastly fruit of a 4 decades long campaign by a highly strategic radical right. That campaign included the use of disinformation as a political tool, the use of legislative and judicial rule rigging to undermine normal established practices of governance, and the weaponizing of tensions over race, religion, and sexuality to put the voters on whom these political entrepreneurs rely in a constant state of fear, anger, and agitation. The deliberate cultivation of ideas, practices, and organizations designed to transform the nation set processes in motion that will be exceedingly difficult to arrest now, if the architects of this calamity even wanted to. And the most powerful and the most culpable show no signs of that, no remorse on a scale that might avert similar successful authoritarian power grabs in future. Rather, we are dealing with engineers who test prototypes and learn from misfires. In fact, I will argue that what the combined evidence highlights is that a particular section, a particular wing of highly ideological corporate capital, one heavily based in the fossil fuel sector, is so determined to shackle democracy to achieve their ends that they are starting to experiment with explosive tactics in the way their counterparts did in Italy in the 1920s and in Germany in the 1930s, which is why this conference theme is so urgent and appropriate. We are seeing many corporate donors on the right, among them some of the largest donors in the United States, turning a blind eye to violence used to intimidate opponents and enable their own securing of control over government. I'll elaborate on the who and the how and the why in a moment, but first I want to give a quick sketch of what has been learned so far by the U.S. House Select Committee charged with investigating the storming of the Capitol and how these preliminary findings point us back to a deeper history. This committee features Representative Jamie Raskin, a longstanding constitutional scholar, as a spokesperson, and he has publicly, on several occasions and in his most recent book, identified three concentric circles of activity that I will be focusing on in part this evening. The first ring consisted of a large outer group of right-wing voters who believed Donald Trump's big lie that the election was stolen from him. This group turned from protesters into rioters in the presence of a smaller militant middle ring. It was made up of hundreds of white power activists who had come armed, trained, and eager for battle. And you saw the role that some of them played in the video, I believe. Then there was an inner ring, the most important ring, of suited officials and advisors situated in the White House and beyond. Directed by Donald Trump himself, this group's members strategized to throw out the election results. Evidence has already come to light that this third ring, the ring of the coup, counted on the violent chaos unleashed by the second ring and the wider crowd for their plan to succeed, to create enough delay to throw the election into Congress. I won't get into the particulars of how that works, but we can talk later. Trump had, in fact, just inadvertently testified to the reliance on these groups and this violence in a recent speech in which he pledged that if he is reelected, he will issue pardons to all those facing criminal charges from January 6th. So the case that I will make this evening is that each of these three rings of activity is the product of decades of intentional cultivation before Trump came on the scene, and so, as Donna Murch signaled, they will remain if and when he goes. I want to discuss them, though, in reverse order, because in fact, the key players behind the snowballing crisis of American democracy are the figures in suits, not those on the streets. As my 2017 book, Democracy in Chains, showed, and subsequent research has elaborated, the crisis of democracy in the United States today is being driven in good part by a network of radical right corporate donors determined to remake the world. Organizations they have funded have radicalized a major political party beyond recognition and cowed its elected officials into submission. In turn, members of that party are encouraging vigilantism now in multiple arenas, in word, deed, and even legislation in the states this party controls, which are now 30 of the 50 states in the US, and I'll come back to that later. This backsliding is not uniform across, the states that are causing the democratic backsliding of the US, in the too passive term of political scientists, are concentrated in the states won by these radicalized officials from one party who often both incite norm-breaking action and then refuse to address it or prosecute it. The inner circle around Donald Trump that strategized to overthrow the election was the result, indirect result, of groundwork laid over decades now with funding from some of the wealthiest individuals in the United States, above all, but not only, Charles Koch, and the network of arch-right corporate libertarian donors he has built. Koch, for those who don't know him or haven't heard of him, has built a personal fortune of over $55 billion, having built an inherited company into one of the largest privately held corporations on the planet, with operations in 60 countries. Its core is fossil fuel refining, but Koch Industries has branched into hedge funds, real estate, artificial intelligence, paper manufacture, and much more. But through it all, Koch has sought ideas for how to effect a radical transformation of society and governance that he, as a very smart man with 3 engineering degrees from MIT, knows to be something the majority would never agree to. This project is so radically new in human history that the social sciences lack even a concept for its scope, audacity, and strategic sophistication. The Koch donor network funds an infrastructure of hundreds of ostensibly separate organizations. Sorry, I guess I skipped him before. I didn't hit it hard enough. These are just some of them. At the national level, they include think tanks such as the Cato Institute and the Heritage Foundation, the American Legislative Exchange Council, a corporate body that writes laws to be passed by, proposed and passed by Republican state legislatures, and the Federalist Society, which works to train right-wing lawyers and judges and then to try to secure seats from them in the courts, which they have succeeded with the current Supreme Court majority. So too, it contains organizing enterprises such as Americans for Prosperity, Concerned Veterans for America, the Libre Initiative, which targets Latino voters, and Generation Opportunity to groom young followers. At a state level, the donor network funds over 150 organizations whose work is aligned through an umbrella body called the State Policy Network. And there are outposts in higher education. The Charles Koch Foundation alone underwrites dozens of centers at colleges and universities, and over 300 institutions now get some form of Koch funding for faculty, students, and programming. Thus, we are talking about myriad organizations working through an integrated division of labor, as the operatives boast to the donors, to radically alter government and society. Toward what end? A quest to bring unfettered, free-rein capitalism into being without being honest with the people. To achieve that, they have bent the Republican Party to their agenda with a discipline at this point, quite frankly, that Joseph Stalin would have admired. And in fact, no entity has done more than this network to turn the party of Abraham Lincoln, Dwight Eisenhower, and even George Herbert Walker Bush into the party of Donald Trump and his loyal MAGA faction, as we refer to them now, named after their Make America Great Again slogan and attire. How did they do it? By funding primary challenges from the right against any Republican elected official who raised taxes, voted to support action on the climate, or otherwise compromised with Democrats. To give you just one measure of the success of this approach, which Koch insiders call the accountability and our secret sauce, so to speak, by 2014, only 8 of 278 Republican members of Congress would admit that climate change was caused by human activity, 8 of 278. So while the end goal of the donors and operatives is what I've come to think about as property supremacy, these actors have, from the 1950s to the present, shown a willingness to leverage white supremacy, anti-feminism, nativism, and homophobia to win. That is, to enlist and even to agitate popular prejudices to move a political economic agenda they know from repeated historical experience to be terribly unpopular, even among many of those who harbor such prejudices. How has this cause, which was utterly marginal for decades, become such a powerhouse? After all, in the 1950s, movement libertarians numbered in the hundreds in the United States, actually in the United States and Europe together. In the 1970s, in the thousands. Even today, polls find that only about 2% of respondents support the hard libertarian agenda, which wants government restricted to only 3 functions: providing for the national defense, ensuring the rule of law, and guaranteeing social order. Put simply, armies, courts, and police. They want to revoke the signature public policies of the 20th century, such as Social Security, workers' rights to collective voice, anti-discrimination measures, and environmental protections, to say nothing of privatizing public education, an inheritance of the 19th century. Yet despite that fringe agenda, by 2016, the libertarian radical right had helped turn the Republican Party into a delivery vehicle for its agenda. Cowed by the donors and an aroused base and backed by boatloads of dark money, newfangled Republicans won all 3 branches of the US government, 3/5 of the state legislatures, and the majority of seats on the US Supreme Court. It was not just dark money that won this staggering power. Rather, I found out in my research for my last book that what enabled this cause to go from early marginality to dominance was a shrewd strategy derived from a school of thought developed by the first Nobel Prize winner in economics from the US South, a man named James McGill Buchanan. Make a long story short, Buchanan tutored corporate libertarian donors, including Charles Koch and his growing network, that if you don't like the outcome of public policy over a long period of time, stop thinking about who rules and start thinking about the rules, and particularly how to change the rules to get what you want. Because, he pointed out, he argued, if you operated within the existing rules, even elected officials who talked your talk would not walk your walk and make themselves unpopular by cutting the popular programs that accounted for the vast majority of government spending and action. Ronald Reagan was exhibit A of the learning curve on this experience. By the time James Buchanan died in 2013, Governor Scott Walker had applied this playbook to the state of Wisconsin, and Republican majorities in a host of other states, including my North Carolina, were radically changing the rules of governance. How did they do it? By breaking down collective power, above all, but not only, that of labor unions. By the most audacious gerrymandering we've ever seen in American political history to enable the minority Republican Party to dominate the majority of state legislatures and the US House of Representatives in positions so secure that the only threats they would face would be from more radical members of their own party. By passing laws to suppress voting by the other party on a scale not seen since the dawn of Jim Crow. And by privatizing public goods from schools to roads and prisons to engorge corporate partners while fragmenting the public. This whole enterprise has depended on systematic disinformation, a strategy tried out by this cause on behalf of tobacco corporations in the 1980s, healthcare corporations in the Clinton years, and perfected by fossil fuel companies, corporations for decades now. By Greenpeace calculations, the Charles Koch Foundation alone has given over $130 million to organizations that spread climate denial and seek to stop government action on the impending climate catastrophe. These donors and the organizations they fund also litigated to win additional rules changes from the courts. One victory opened the spigots to unlimited corporate money to sway elections. Another enabled mass voter suppression. A third aimed at the destruction of public sector unions. Still another declared partisan gerrymandering to be wrong, but beyond the ability of courts to stop, and more. And while Charles Koch once called Donald Trump a monster, the Koch network used the Trump presidency to get 3 Supreme Court appointments, huge tax cuts for corporations and the wealthiest Americans, rollbacks of environmental, civil rights, women's rights, and labor protections, and much more. To bring this discussion back to the insurrection of January 6th, one of this network's core organizations supplied the ideas that informed the plotters of the attempted coup. That is, the Federalist Society. John Eastman The chairman of its section on federalism produced the constitutional fig leaf and legal strategy for the attempt to declare the election results invalid and to seek to appoint other electors that would be pro-Trump. What the theory was designed to enable, in the words of one attorney working to protect American democracy, and I quote, is legislative nullification of the popular vote for president. So that's the first wing of actors in the insurrection, the suit-wearing network that abetted the coup effort and has been cultivated over decades by far-right corporate donors. The second ring of key players in the events of January 6th was made up by members of armed white power organizations such as the Oath Keepers, the Proud Boys, and the militias, who did much to get other people to Washington and then to radicalize them by instigation and example once there. These groups, too, have deep roots in America's tradition of white vigilantism. I won't say as much about them in this tradition because I know that will be a focus of Professor Alex Hinton's address tomorrow evening. But their members came to Washington prepared and equipped for violence. They spearheaded it through the day, as I believe you saw in some cases. In short, they used force to do what Donald Trump and his team incited followers to do: stop the alleged steal, in their case physically, by interrupting what is usually a pro forma counting of electoral college votes by Congress. Virtually every aspect of these groups' language, attire, paraphernalia, and conduct echoed the long American vigilante tradition, which, as was mentioned earlier, emerged from white settler attacks on Native peoples in the 18th and 19th centuries, slave patrols in the run-up to the Civil War, and post-emancipation extra-legal violence against African Americans. This tradition treated white Christian men as the supreme citizens, those Sarah Palin famously called real Americans. And it was this sense of entitlement that led mob leaders to attack police officers as traitors. Because those police officers were members of a multiracial force that also included women defending a multiracial democracy and Congress, at least on the Democratic side. And here are some of the officers who testified in the impeachment hearing, quite movingly if you managed to hear their testimony. As transnational research on the slide of democracies into civil wars has revealed, the trajectory of a group's political status is key. People were especially likely to fight if they had once had power and saw it slipping away, reports the political scientist Barbara Walters in her comparative book just released this year called How Civil Wars Start. Walters also points out that the United States is predicted to be the first of the leading Western nations to transition to a non-white majority. And social psychologists have shown that mentioning that actually makes people in experiments, white people, more hostile to people of color in the subsequent questions. Other researchers have uncovered what they call one meaningful correlation to have emerged from studies of those arrested on January 6th, because there's no simple reduction by class, income, Biden, Trump states, et cetera. That was insurgents were much more likely to come from a county where the white share of the population was in decline. That strong link, the reporters said, held up in every state. Some MAGA militants at the Capitol performed their sense of historical lineage by carrying the Confederate battle flag, as we talked about before, and also by hoisting the Gadsden flag, which features a coiled snake ready to strike with the words, "Don't tread on me." This one originated in the American Revolution. Lately, it has been claimed by the libertarian right. And not coincidentally, it evokes an era in which citizenship was limited to white male property owners. So too, the right-wing insurrectionists at the Capitol summoned the horrible American tradition of lynching, which took over 3,000 Black lives at its peak by shouting, "Hang Mike Pence," repeatedly. Why? Because Pence had refused to abet their presidents attempt to stay in power against the will of voters whom the vigilantes considered illegitimate. The mob seemed to show a particular venom for Democratic women leaders, above all Nancy Pelosi, whose name they called out as they stalked the hallways in search of her and her office, which they ransacked and defiled, as in this famous image. Also notable in the sense of entitlement the crowd's agitators felt was the strong showing of military and police personnel in the mob. Indeed, at least 14% of the participants investigators have found had a service record, many of them active duty police back home. As in earlier vigilantism by the KKK and white power groups, this speaks to Usmain's presentation this afternoon, the involvement of uniformed members of the agencies of the state that monopolize force, again, armies, courts, and police, has historically conferred legitimacy on extralegal violence. The idea being, of course, that if police, soldiers, and/or military officers were involved, surely the acts were rightful and indeed patriotic. All of these things work to convey the message that the insurrectionists were the true Americans. Therefore, they had the right to prevent the certification of Joe Biden, the choice of so many, in their view, un-American voters, and to ensure the continued rule of their hero, Donald Trump. Moreover, they have said then and since in interviews and court proceedings that they came on the appeal of their president to stop the steal. No, that's good. Or lose their country. So that's the second circle, the seditionists who viewed themselves as restoring their rightful place as the people whose votes most counted. They also saw January 6th as a recruitment action and aimed to build their ranks from the outer ring of the three involved in these events. That third ring was comprised of avid Trump voters who believed the big lie and came out to do as their then president urged. But the fact that they believed such a lie, it is crucial to understand, is in no way due solely to Donald Trump and his magnetism. Rather, they have been primed for decades for this susceptibility to distrust, or rather to trust purposeful disinformation. At the heart of the big lie was the axiom that the mainstream media was so biased and unreliable as to be irrelevant as a source of information. It's often assumed in accounts of these events that this axiom emerged with social media. Not true. In fact, the trope of the untrustworthy liberal media was first propagated by segregationists who sought to discredit the Black freedom movement in the 1950s and beyond. Later, in the 1980s, the donors I described and the organizations they funded worked to eliminate what was called the fairness doctrine in broadcasting, which they achieved in 1987. In the 1990s, they helped secure the deregulation of the telecommunications industry. These victories over accurate reporting, regulated reporting, you could say, of the news opened the floodgates to a closed right-wing media ecosystem that has made disinformation and demagogic agitation hugely profitable. Think only for the moment of the media empire built by the now multi-billionaire Rupert Murdoch, whose Fox News abetted Donald Trump at every turn, and the rise of right-wing radio, talk radio, as personified by Rush Limbaugh since the 1990s and his acolytes and imitators, since Donald Trump actually gave a presidential Medal of Freedom to Rush Limbaugh, if you missed that. So this closed media ecosystem, communication scholars have found, systematically misinforms its audiences. Critics have come to speak of it as the outrage industry for how it exists, not to report news, but to cultivate a fearful and angry political identity and to provoke its intended audience to a state of high alarm and engagement. It makes the audience feel like they are under siege by mortal enemies who look down on them, who condescend to them, and who seek to hurt them and take from them what they hold most dear: their children, their churches, their guns, their country. After all, You cannot make most people into aggressors unless you first convince them that they are victims. And when you dehumanize those you see as a threat through the chronic use of eliminationist rhetoric, moreover, as the political right and the Republican Party has done, many in the party have done, at least since the heyday of Newt Gingrich and the so-called Republican Revolution of the 1990s, that makes some people indifferent to the violence they inflict. It is no coincidence, too, that Fox targets a particular demographic, conservative white Christians, above all, fearful white evangelical Protestants, who have proven to be the most reliable Republican voters over recent decades, but also the most loyal Trump backers. Many of them, after all, have been taught that the Bible is infallible. So science has been suspect to them, at least since evolution started being taught in the schools. That rejection of facts that clashed with doctrine made them ideal targets for the climate science denialism coming from fossil fuel corporations and their political allies, and for claims that inconvenient truths were fake news. Thanks to ardent cultivation by deep-pocketed donors, including but not limited to those in the Koch network and the entrepreneurial religious operations that they fund, many of those white that's actually the wrong slide for the point, sorry. I didn't find a picture for the point I was trying to make. Many of those white evangelical voters have crossed over into Christian nationalism, having been convinced of three things. First, that the founders of the United States designed it to be a Christian, really a Protestant nation, which is not true, but proved useful for political mobilization of large numbers. Second, that their God-given dominance is under attack from hostile others. And third, that they are thus justified in seeking to establish dominion over government to keep others from taking over God's land. Indeed, so deep is the tribal loyalty the right has cultivated over decades now that a year after the insurrection, with all the revelations that have come since then, 70% of Republicans, pollsters find, believe the big lie. They believe that democracy is under threat from the Democrats who are working to protect it. 57% now say they would never vote for a candidate who says Joe Biden won the election. A third approve of using violence to achieve political ends. As the New York Times editorial board summed up the situation a year later, every day is January 6th now. With that in mind, let me turn to the second part of my title and the shorter part of my talk, the likely sequels of January 6th. How Republican Party officials have responded to the insurrection and attempted coup has ominous implications for the future because it shows that one of the two major parties in the United States has turned away from the truth and against democracy. After some initial condemnation, the day of the insurrection and in the weeks that followed, most of the party's representatives and that supporting media, and this was a Tucker Carlson frame, Patriot Purge, when the arrests started, have turned to denialism and enabling. The big lie that Trump won the election is now widely promoted by Republican elected officials, either directly and explicitly or by omission and not talking about it. And as I showed, it is believed by the party's voters. It has become a kind of litmus test for a party that has stepped outside the constitutional order and implicitly embraced vigilantism on multiple fronts. That is why, instead of penance after the deadly debacle, we saw instead almost instant efforts to ensure that the next attempt at a technically legal election sabotage could succeed. Recall that even after the barbaric attack on their workplace had driven members of Congress from the floor to safe hiding, when they reassembled, most Republican members of Congress still voted not to certify the election results showing that Biden won the election. So too, Republican opposition to investigating the events of January 6th has proved near monolithic. Some even made light of the violence, saying it was merely, and I quote, a normal tourist visit. Only 2 Republicans agreed to serve on the House Select Committee, quite heroically in these conditions, one of whom, Liz Cheney, was promptly condemned by her state party, stripped of her leadership positions in Congress, and now faces a fierce primary challenge from a well-funded MAGA member of her party. Adam Kinzinger, the sole other Republican on the committee, has already announced that he won't even try to run again. Earlier this week, the Republican National Committee voted to censor both representatives, denouncing the investigation as, and I quote, persecution of ordinary citizens engaged in legitimate political discourse, end quote. So too, Republicans in 41 states have rushed to make sure the next coup can succeed by passing legislation to change how elections are run and counted and to suppress voting. Reports the New York Times, and this is dated, there's actually more reporting coming out today, more laws. Nearly 36 laws have been passed that empower state legislatures to sabotage their own elections and overturn the will of their voters. Moreover, all of this has been accompanied by a tolerance for and even promotion of quasi-vigilante activity by party leaders. National and state Republican elected officials have turned a blind eye to what are rampant death threats to and harassment of election officials, both Republicans and Democrats, who recognized that President Biden won. There has been no condemnation from leading Republicans of such attempts at intimidation, much less calls for prosecution. On the contrary, what we're seeing, and especially with mounting power last year in this, is that the party is normalizing political violence short of injury and death. They are using attacks on schools as a particular recruitment and election winning tactic to gain back particularly white suburban voters that they had lost. Over the past year, the Koch network grantees and their Republican allies have found electoral gold in some places in threatening educators and disrupting school board meetings to, I was supposed to show you that about the election laws, sorry. You can see how many have passed. Disrupting local school board meetings to stop COVID mask mandates, along with teaching and books that right-wing parents disapprove. And again, far from condemning the intimidation, often physical, of schools, school superintendents, teachers, and even students, Fox News and Republican officials goaded. Republican state legislators have proposed and passed laws to punish teachers with huge fines, sometimes criminal penalties too, for honest teaching about racism. It is now obvious that Republican election strategists see these battles over schools as a way to excite fearful white voters to turn out in large numbers to defeat Democrats in the midterm elections later this year. How serious is the potential for much worse violence from the right in a future election, owing to all of what I've just described? 3 retired generals published an op-ed in the Washington Post in December to warn of a split in the armed forces in 2024 if civilian leaders do not hold accountable those who drove the insurrection and coup attempt and act decisively to fix the conditions that brought the nation to this point. These generals pointed to how more than 1 in 10 of those who attacked the country had served in the armed forces, and that Donald Trump enjoyed public support for his big lie from 124 retired admirals and brigadier generals who called themselves Flag Officers for America. I accidentally deleted that one. Flag Officers for America. The three generals warned of what they called the potential for a total breakdown of the chain of command along partisan lines if in the event of another insurrection like January 6th. In a contested election, they explained, and I'm quoting, some might follow orders from the rightful commander-in-chief, while others might follow the Trumpian loser. Under such a scenario, it is not outlandish to say that a military breakdown could lead to civil war. Sounding a similar alarm, a retired Army colonel pointed out to me that the 400 million guns in the United States are concentrated in the Trump belt, which encompasses the states of the former Confederacy, along with parts of the Mountain West and now the Midwest. In a nutshell, then, if we don't reckon with the deep historical roots of the storming of the Capitol on January 6th, those events could turn out to be a prologue to a far worse outcome in the future. What might that outcome look like based on what we saw on January 6th? Here's a plausible scenario. After the defeat of the 2021 pilot attempt, the well-funded strategists in suits devise a more effective coup. The white power insurgents supply the firepower to cause violent pandemonium that can be used to justify an authoritarian clampdown. And the mass of disinformed MAGA voters cheer the combined action for saving the country as they know it, while the Supreme Court's right-wing majority of 6-3 blesses it as in keeping with Federalist theory. How am I doing on time? 5 more minutes or so? No? Okay, so I want to point out that sadly this is not just a US story, because 2 of the 3 rings in the January 6th insurrection are transnational. Both the white power radicals and the suited strategists are part of world-changing events elsewhere, world-changing efforts elsewhere. And in fact, operations funded by far-right US billionaires and multimillionaires and their overseas counterparts are intentionally fomenting combustion on other continents. In each case, there are actors who, in the name of free markets and freedom from government control, are styling themselves the true inheritors of their nations, relying on media that disinforms the public and employs eliminationist rhetoric, dehumanizing hate talk, some of which we heard about earlier, and engages in militant agitation, most recently against science-justified public health measures to stem the global pandemic, such as lockdowns and mask requirements. Let me take up what I view as the lesser threat, as serious as it is, the street component. The US vigilante right has looked abroad for inspiration and allies all the way back to the Ku Klux Klan of the 1920s, an era in which the Ku Klux Klan achieved its largest ever and national following. As I showed in my first book, Behind the Mask of Chivalry, the organization's leaders saw Mussolini and his street troops as kin. The Klan newspaper asserted that Mussolini's fight to crush communism and anarchy was an entirely worthy cause. One New York leader stated that relationship aptly. The Ku Klux Klan, he explained, is the Mussolini of America. Moreover, after the onset of the Great Depression, when organizations emerged in the United States that openly identified with fascists abroad, black shirts and brown shirts, the Klan stood with them. Since the 1970s, US white power groups have become more self-consciously global, as we heard today with reference to the reverence for Nazis, and they have also sought to connect with their counterparts abroad, particularly in Europe, Australia, and South Africa, to create a borderless paramilitary white power movement. These activists read one another's manifestos, take inspiration from one another's violent acts, and share an ideology that seeks to overthrow existing national governments and create in their stead an Aryan nation. While the vigilante radical right seeks allies abroad, The capitalist radical right has been infinitely more successful in doing this, having for decades now invested tens, if not hundreds of millions of dollars to build out an international grid of partners. Called the Atlas Network, in a nod to Ayn Rand's pro-capitalist manifesto, Atlas Shrugged, it now claims over 450 affiliates in nearly 100 countries. I believe there are 4 in Italy. The affiliates enjoy funding from the US Koch network of donors and also allied indigenous wealthy persons, often again with heavy support from fossil fuel-based fortunes. Atlas presents itself to the global public as a nonprofit body, quote, strengthening the worldwide freedom movement. What could possibly be wrong with that? A lot, it turns out. As in the case of the Koch network's domestic operations in the US, the talk of freedom packages a cause which does more than simply compete in the marketplace of ideas to win converts. Investigations undertaken to date, mainly by journalists, but also by a growing number of scholars, have found that many Atlas affiliates operate in secrecy, use disinformation to sway public opinion, violate tax laws to shield donors, and worse. Most concerning for our inquiry at this conference is the collaboration of a number of Atlas affiliates in the rise of right-wing populism that at minimum legitimizes political violence and at worst helps instigate and abet it. The global organizing burst coincided with the intensification of the US project in the late 1990s and thereafter. Between 1995 and 2015, the number of Atlas affiliates quadrupled. And again, you know, we only have beginning study of this, but one thing that I have found in my work and others are starting to look at is the weaponizing of religious fears to gain a base in different countries. Brexit offers a good example of how Atlas-based relationships and transnational flows of money and tactical training can produce what one insider called a Big Bang change. England's Institute for Economic Affairs, the founding Atlas organization, promoted Brexit from the outset. But it also had support from some of its own multinationals in the UK, but also Charles Koch and his allied donors and 5 of the US Atlas partners. In the apt summary of one Guardian headline, quote, wealthy US donors give millions to right-wing UK groups. 11 Americans gave 3.7 million between 2014 and 2019 in the run-up to Brexit. As one member of parliament and chair of a committee inquiry into the role played by disinformation summarized, we've got to recognize the bigger picture here. This is being coordinated across national borders by very wealthy people in a way we haven't seen before. As with Brexit, so with Brazil's sharp right turn. Foreign investment helped turn indigenous kindling into a roaring flame. Brazilian Atlas partners helped put Jair Bolsonaro in power in 2018. A former army captain, known racist, and virulent homophobe, he is also an ally of domestic and multinational capital, and especially extractive corporations. Think Amazon. Back in 1999, Bolsonaro shared his dream of a civil war that would let him, quote, do the job the military regime didn't do. Killing 30,000, the 30,000 people who blocked the right's agenda. Brazilian Atlas affiliates brought him closer to that dream by helping to fuel what one scholar calls a cultural war against the Workers' Party, a labor-based and multiracial party. Reminds me of the CGT attack that you described earlier. The campaign included incendiary lies directed at evangelicals about what was going on in schools, featuring ridiculous pornography. Anyway, and also a group called Students for Liberty organized massive street demonstrations, which prepared the way for the parliamentary coup that removed the Workers' Party president so that Bolsonaro could run. Switch over to Central Europe. In a 2019 study of the Austrian economic tradition, long promoted by Charles Koch and his grantees, the historian Yannick Wasserman has documented the existence of what he calls a libertarian to alt-right pipeline. Wasserman shows how, in a repeating pattern, numerous ardent believers in Austrian economics have peeled off to neo-fascism. Not most, to be sure, but enough to hint at what may lie ahead. Some Atlas participants in Germany and Austria are cultivating relationships with neo-Nazi parties. Wasserman demonstrates an alarming degree of interaction between the rightists and Austrian supporters of free markets and economic liberty. As in the United States, on January 6th, one side brings militant ground troops, while the other brings deep-pocketed donors, highly placed political and intellectual allies, and a coherent policy strategy. And as the interested, ideological, ultra-rich see the utility of these troops for winning contests in divided nations, the potential for authoritarian outcomes grows. In short, I believe we are seeing the emergence of a playbook that can be adapted to different settings, and that it is not just a coincidence that this is arising in so many places in the same years. To return in closing to the three circles of complicity in the American intervention, it seems wise, in fact, imperative, to anticipate their reassembly in 2024 and beyond. The third suited circle of the coup is already purloining power to achieve more control at the state level in the 22 midterms and in the courts. Now, after January 6th, they know that they can count on the white power right and the militant conspiracy believers to step in with violence when needed. And both groups have seen that the MAGA faction of the Republican Party is ready to believe that such a pincers action of elite donor strategy on one side and street action on the other is needed to save their country. These are dangerous times indeed. True, they lack the pitched class conflict of the 1920s and the economic depression of the 1930s, yet they feature new accelerants: a global corporate radical right, impending climate catastrophe that is already generating massive refugee flows, mostly of people of color, and craven social media moguls. History never repeats itself in quite the same way, but we have entered a startling transnational downward spiral, unless the defenders of democracy recognize the immensity of the threat and combine to outsmart, outvote, and fetter as never before the lethal militant minority exposed on January 6th. Thank you.
Riveting, frightening, thinking about transnationalism and collaboration in very different terms than I did about an hour and 15 minutes ago. We have time maybe for one, possibly two, depending on how long they are, questions.
I'll be brief in my reply.
If you'd like to ask them, please come up and do so.
Then again, I may be the last thing standing before you and between you and a glass of wine at the end of a very long day. So we may want to talk informally, but let me see if there's anybody who's summoned up. Great, Andrea. Yeah, I saw great kinship between your presentation and mine. So I felt that was a sequel.
Good. Thank you very much. It was fantastic. Well, boring,
Yeah.
but fantastic. Now, I have just a quick question. I mean, do you see any pattern of radicalization in terms of Trump since he arrived? Because I mean, was he radical before? Because I mean,
yeah,
in terms of style, initially reminded me a bit of Berlusconi in the way that I followed his inaugural speech, and it was a textbook of populism. I mean, it looked like Peron. But I mean, if I look at the speech that he made in the morning of the insurrection, I mean, that was very different.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah, such an important question. Thank you. And I think that you're absolutely right that there was an evolution. And he's an interesting figure. I mean, obviously, he's not learned, but he is clever. And he is very responsive to audience response. So can't get into all the details here, but I think a really good example of what you're talking about is the build the wall business. It wasn't even in his prepared remarks for one of the speeches that he was giving, but it kind of came, at least this is what I've read about it, came to mind. He said it, the audience went crazy. And so as he saw how his audiences, his fans were responding to this build the wall and anti-immigrant sentiment, he started putting more of that in. So there's other examples like that. And then I think another thing was that once he came to office, some of the economic populist language, we can't even remember almost now from the campaign trail, right? But, a critique of the impact of American free trade agreements, most obviously NAFTA, on, industrial workers and manufacturing, a promise that they would get rid of the Affordable Care Act, but they would get something better. It would be nothing, it would be better. He talked about how our tax system was so skewed to privilege people like him and hurt ordinary people, on and on and on. All of that stuff before he got elected in 2016. Once he got elected, it was sort of surround sound from the kind of people that I'm talking about, because he didn't really have the establishment type. So his office was, his strategic team and much of his cabinet came out of these Koch network positions, and the policy agenda, with the exception of stuff about trade, they balked at that, and they balked at some of the ugliness against immigrants, because they would rather have, free flows of labor at all levels. But with those two exceptions, they got so much from that administration. And I think Trump saw that he was not delivering, and in fact could not create factory jobs in the US in the way that he planned. So then he pushed harder on the racism and the nativism and the implicit appeals to vigilantism. So you're absolutely right that there was an evolution over time in response to circumstances of different types. Anybody else?
My question was about, so in my talk, I was going to talk a bit about the organizing of Black police officers, but I didn't get to that. So I wondered, I know that particularly after George Floyd, there was a tremendous amount of sort of efforts by, African-American police, other police associations of color, and then of course the tradition going back to, all the way back to Reconstruction of Black armed resistance. I'm wondering if you have any streams that, I hear the rumors about, sort of images on social media, but, is that another potential entity? And I'm also thinking about the FBI now and some of the work it's done to arrest higher level politicians, particularly in the South. So,
yeah, really interesting questions. And I will say, because of the conference theme, I was emphasizing the dark side and the scale of the threat. But I have to say, as a US historian who is also going back in current work to look at the antebellum period, we think we have a challenge. Look at what the enslaved faced globally. In the early part of the 19th century, in the United States, every single institution was on their side. The courts, the Constitution, the state legislatures, the newspapers, the higher education, everything was arrayed against the enslaved. Yet somehow, through agitation and through, again, an evolving situation, that changed. When I put my activist hat off, my scholar's hat off and my activist hat on, one of the things that's been amazing about doing this book is that it did reach, the general public we hoped for, it actually did reach. So, I've spoken to literally hundreds of groups on all points of the progressive spectrum, faith congregations, just all kinds of surprising partners sometimes as well in this, including some friends now in the military who are very concerned. So there is tremendous potential for for dealing with this. But for us to do that, oh, and the other thing I wanted to say is the amount of Black talent in particular in the US and of well-placed African Americans, as you're suggesting, with the police, we could talk about politics, we could talk about the courts, other things like nothing is going to replay as it did then. And I think there's tremendous cultural legitimacy to anti-racism, as we saw in the wake of the murder of George Floyd. So there are many, many, many resources out there. And absolutely, I believe that what I'm talking about can be done. But again, it takes recognizing that threat. It takes looking for the resources. It takes letting people know what's happening and reaching existing contingents, groups of organized people who care, including, as you say, the Black officers. And that has been something, actually, Black officers and the fight to open up the policing profession and fight the racism within it go back, at least to the 1960s, and many of those battles in fire departments as well. But also in terms of historical memory, it was interesting that there was a big story in the Atlantic saying, I think the title was something like, was January 6th practice or something? Anyway, it's very powerful. I quoted some from it, but Barton Gellman is the author. But one of the people he profiled who was involved in the January 6th events was this white guy who also had his own deep historical memory. And it took me back to my second book because he had been trying to get into the New York firefighters program at a time of affirmative action when female firefighters had, had an impact on the department. And he particularly mentioned one woman who was a leader of that when I was writing, I thought nobody knew, but here's this guy who's been carrying that grudge and a slew of other ones he put into, his backpack over the years and took to January 6th. So yeah, thank you for that question.
Thank you for your super talk. I was wondering while listening to you, and it's a question also about what I'm studying on the origins of fascism, etc. If this is the crisis of democracy, or if the crisis of democracy is what makes it possible.
Thank you. That was so beautifully and lucidly and concisely stated. And in other talks that I give on this work on the book Democracy in Chains, that is precisely what I say, that we would not be in this position, and Donald Trump never would have become president of the United States had there not been a pre-existing crisis of democracy brought on by a number of things. We could get into the ways in which our Constitution has articles that always made democracy a challenge to make it function. Some of those put in by the most arch slaveholders, actually with pushback from Madison and others. So this is like South Carolina and Georgia really pushed for some of the things that are really causing havoc now. So there's a whole constitutional level to this. There's also the flood of corporate money in American politics. People in other countries with sane electoral systems just can't believe when they hear what is possible in the US in the name of speech, right? And First Amendment rights in the litigation that brought it forward. Also, these levels of disinformation. We would not be here, had Fox News and talk radio not assumed the proportions that they did. And also, if you're in a situation in a money-driven political system, as we are, both sides are going to play that. Otherwise, it's unilateral disarmament. So Democrats have very close corporate partners, and there's a fight for the soul of the Democratic Party going on now, which I think Donna Murch was pointing to in her concluding remarks, to say, is this going to be the party of, the image going with the FDR, right, and of working people and later African Americans, women, et cetera, or is it going to be a party that is prevented from doing what that overwhelming majority wants on issue after issue by corporate donors and corporate money? And so we've seen that, even the Democrats now have nothing like the majorities that FDR had or Lyndon Johnson had in the 1960s, where they have 40 or 50 seats. They could stand to lose 10 and have no trouble. we have two Democratic senators who have blocked most of what Joe Biden campaigned on. It's tremendously frustrating. Both of them are deeply committed to corporations, openly speak to corporations about their service to them. So that is making it really, really difficult to solve this crisis, because as Donna Murch was saying in her comments, for democracy to survive, and you're suggesting that, I think, with your question, for democracy to seem worth people investing the commitment that they're going to have to invest at this point, it's got to show that it can deliver for people, right? That it can make your lives better, that it can solve your problems. And, you know, so I really think that Joe Biden is genuinely trying to do that, but, you know, with such a slim minority, I mean, such a, you know, kind of like a one seat majority if the vice president votes, it's nearly impossible. But maybe I'll close with one more thing, and it will sound partisan, but it's not partisan in the circumstances we're faced with when we have a party that's operating within the constitutional order and one that has stepped outside. Joe Manchin, the senator from West Virginia, who has blocked so much, said to some critics, hey, if you don't like me or what I'm doing, there's a solution. Elect more progressive Democrats. So, I mean, I think rather than be discouraged and throw in the towel, what we've seen is a moment that demands that people recommit to the democratic process and understand this is a marathon. It's not a sprint. If it were a sprint, it would have been solved. But this is precisely the moment not to get disappointed and disengaged, but instead to think about everything you value and care about, because most of us do share many of the same values. That's all on the line right now. And what we do will determine what comes out. So thank you all for being such a great audience.